Les Miserables was first translated into English in 1862, and that first English translation of the book has preserved the French title Les Miserables even in translation. And that's been a pattern, that's been a common way of translating the book ever since then. And so the implication there, the fact that so often English translations preserve the French title, implies that there's something not translatable about that title. Of course, if you type the words Les Miserables into Google Translate, for example, to get a translation, you'll see The Miserables. But if you think about it, The Miserables doesn't really work as a translation for this title. This book is not really about misery. It's not a book about people who are miserable. It's actually much more about a subclass, a strata of society. It's about the lower class of French society at the time in the setting that Victor Hugo is writing. Reading now from Graham Robb's biography of Victor Hugo. Quote, "Originally, a miserable was simply a pauper. Since the Revolution, and especially since the advent of Napoleon III, a miserable had become a dreg, a sore on the shining face of the Second Empire. The new sense would dictate a translation like scum of the earth. Hugo's sense would dictate the wretched." End quote. So what Graham Robb is saying is that over the course of Victor Hugo's working on this project, from the time period in which the book is set to the time period in which the book is published, which is the reign of Napoleon III, the sense of the word miserable changed. And for many of Victor Hugo's readers, the word miserable means scum, scum of the earth. And indeed, in the Penguin Classic edition of Les Miserables, translated by Christine Donaher, which is the translation I switched over to in the middle of reading Book 2, the title of that book is The Wretched. And in this video, I'm going to try to put forth the argument to you that the shade of the word scum, scum of the earth, or refuse, or muck, in all its connotations, in all its forms, is very much alive and present in the book and in the title of the book as well. And so as we've seen so far in this read-along, Hugo is very much interested in shining a light on this underclass of society. He's interested in shining a light on the wretched of French society, and he's asking us to look unflinchingly. And he's challenging us, and he says, what do you think of when you see these people? Do you see something disgusting? Do you see something repulsive? Are you grossed out? Or can you have compassion? Of course, in modern American society, talking to you from the year 2023 in an urban area, the question is, when you see the homeless people on the street, when you read about the prostitute or the ex-criminal, what do you see? When you read about the drug addicted, do you see people who are disgusting and repulsive, invisible, largely invisible? Or can you have compassion? And can you see in that a moral obligation? The title of the book, Les Miserables, is drawn from the text of the book. And it's drawn from a part of the book in Book 3 of Les Miserables, where we have Marius, one of our main characters of the book, who's living a very impoverished lifestyle, and he has a neighbor living next to him who is also extremely impoverished. And at this juncture in the book, Marius helps out his neighbor pay the rent. And we find out that his neighbors are actually the Thénardiers, which we knew from earlier on in the book, from Book 2, they were innkeepers. And so Marius is their neighbor, and he has a peephole. He can see through a tiny little hole in the wall and see what it's like, where they live. And so Hugo describes Marius's perspective on this household. Quote, "They seemed very depraved, very corrupt, very debased, heinous even. But rare are those who fall without sinking into vice. In any case, there is a point where the poor and the wicked become mixed up and lumped together in one fateful word, Les Miserables, the wretched. Whose fault is this? And besides, should not charity be all the greater the further into the depths we fall?" End quote. And so, we, the reader, throughout the book are very much like Marius. We're looking at these characters through the peephole that Victor Hugo gives us, through his lens, and we see these wretched, heinous, debased, evil, corrupt people. In this context, the Thénardiers, in addition to their abuse to Cosette earlier in Book 2, they actively try to kidnap Cosette again. They threaten Jean Valjean's life, they kidnap him, they threaten all sorts of menace. They end up getting arrested and going to jail. So we're talking about criminal people, the criminal underclass of society. And the question is, what do we make of this? What do we do with the existence of these people in our society? Hugo's deep sense of compassion, of course, was already evident from book 1, where we learn about the character of Fantine, and she was working in Jean Valjean's factory, trying to support her child, Cosette, and she ends up getting fired from the factory, and she has to work as a prostitute to make money to send to the Thénardiers to support Cosette. And there's a scene there where she's walking the streets and men are jeering at her and scoffing at her, and it's wintertime and it's cold and she's ill-dressed, and a man puts a snowball down her back, and she sort of retaliates and fights back, and Javert, the police officer, arrests her, and she's taken to the jail. And then at that point, Jean Valjean steps in and takes her under her wing. And at one point, while she's dying, Jean Valjean says to her very compassionately, "Poor mother, you've suffered a great deal. Yours is the dowry of the elect." He says to her, "You're leaving behind this hell on earth to be greeted by the angels in heaven." The third book of Les Miserables, titled Marius, opens with Hugo's description of the gamine, which is like a French word for like a street urchin, this homeless child living on the street. Quote, "This little being is joyous. He does not eat every day, and he sees a show every evening if he feels like it. He has no shirt on his back, no shoes on his feet, no roof over his head. He is like the flies in the air that have none of all that. He is aged between 7 and 13, lives in gangs, roams the streets, sleeps rough, wears an old pair of his father's trousers that come down over his heels, some other father's old hat that comes down below his ears, a single brace made of a strip of yellow cloth. He gads about, keeps his eyes peeled, scrounges, dawdles, breaks in tobacco pipes, swears like a trooper, haunts the tavern, associates with thieves, backchats and whores, talks slang, sings dirty songs, and has not an ounce of wickedness in his heart. The fact is, he has in his soul a pearl, innocence, and pearls do not dissolve in the mire." And that's a key word that we're going to keep seeing again and again. Mire. So long as man is a child, God wants him to be innocent. If you were to ask that huge city, "What is that?" it would reply, "That's my little one." End quote. And of course, this is the central argument of the book, that these street urchins, these dirty, illiterate, criminal underclass of society, disruptive, dangerous, Hugo wants us to see their humanity. Hugo wants us to say, that's one of our children. Hugo continues, "The wan child of Paris's poorer neighborhoods lives and develops in hardship, growing up physically stunted, a thoughtful witness to the social realities and human goings-on around him. He thinks he is blithe, he is not. He watches, ready to laugh, and not only to laugh, whoever you may be, whether your name is prejudice, abuse, ignorance, oppression, iniquity, despotism, injustice, fanaticism, tyranny, beware the gaping gamine." End quote. And this is, I think, a very important point. He says that this underclass is dangerous. And of course, this book, Les Miserables, is a book about revolution. It's about the revolution of the underclass. He wants us to look at the underclass in part to understand what breeds, what generates a violent revolt. And this book is about a violent, bloody revolt. Quote, "Of what clay is he made? Of any old mud, a handful of dirt, a breath, and behold Adam." Victor Hugo writes so beautifully. End quote. The theme of the mud and the mire and the muck and the scum is very important in Les Miserables. In book 5, we're going to get Hugo's famous digression and description of the sewers of Paris. And this is like an iconic moment of the book. A lot of people who read this book, walk away remembering this digression into the sewers of Paris. And so just to give us a little taste of that, Hugo at this point describes what it would be like to die in the sewers. Quote, "Can anyone imagine such a death? If sinking into the ground is terrible on the seashore, what is it in the sewer? Instead of fresh air, the full light of day, that clear horizon, those spacious sounds, those free-moving clouds and their life-giving rain, those vessels seen in the distance, that hope in every guise, passers-by, likely, help possible right up to the last minute. Instead of all this, deafness, blindness, a black vault, the inside of a tomb already prepared, death in the lidded mire, a slow smothering by muck, a stone coffin where asphyxia opens its claws in the filth and takes you by the throat. Foulness mingled with the death rattle, sludge instead of the strand, hydrogen sulfide instead of the hurricane, excrement instead of the ocean, and the shouting and gnashing of teeth and writhing and struggling and agonizing, and this enormous city overhead, aware of nothing. Everywhere else the tomb is sinister, here it is monstrous." End quote. And this hellish landscape, this sewer, I think is the ultimate visual metaphor for what Hugo is trying to do. Because of course the lowest class of society dies this way. They die invisible. They die out of sight, in the muck, in the filth. And that is what I think to a large extent, in a partial way, Les Miserables is about. Hugo wants us to walk like Jean Valjean through that sewer, through that excrement, to see the humanity of those people who live that way and understand their significance, understand what they mean, what they say about society, and what they prophesy for society. One last example of Hugo's obsession with excrement in this book, the way in which the theme of excrement comes up again and again, is from Book 2. Back in the beginning of Book 2, we had the Waterloo section where Hugo was giving us the history of Waterloo. And he tells the story of Pierre Cambronne, who is one of Napoleon's generals, and he was captured at Waterloo. And Napoleon describes the scene where Cambronne is facing the English artillery, and death is over his head and the last remaining French soldiers. And the English general calls out to him, and he says, "Surrender, brave Frenchmen." And Hugo now tells us how Cambronne responded. Quote, "There they are, all the kings of Europe, the satisfied generals, the thundering Jupiters. They number 100,000 victorious soldiers, and behind the 100,000 a million, their cannons with their fuses lit, stand gaping. They have the imperial guard and the grand army under their heel. They have just crushed Napoleon, and there is no one left but Cambronne. There is no one left to protest but this worm. He will protest. He searches for a word, as a man searches for a sword. A spume rises within him, and this spume is the word. In the face of this extraordinary and undistinguished victory, in face of this victory with none victorious, this despairing man draws himself up. He suffers the enormity of it, but he can see its emptiness, and he more than spits on it. And overwhelmed by numbers, by superior force and circumstance, he finds in his soul an expression. And here's the expression: excrement. You might as well have said feces or scum. Hugo continues, we repeat it. To say that, to do that, to light on that is to be the victor, Hugo writes. He continues, at that word from Cambronne, the English voice responded, fire. The batteries blazed, the hill trembled. From every cannon issued a last dreadful belch of grape shot. The immense smoke billowed, a dim whiteness under the moonrise. And when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. That formidable remnant had been annihilated. The guard was dead. The four walls of the living redoubt lay on the ground, only the merest quiver detectable here and there among those bodies. And so it was that the French legions, greater than the Roman legions, expired on Mont Saint-Jean, on the Rhine, and blood-soaked earth in the mournful rye fields, on the spot where Joseph, who drives a Nivelles mail coach, now passes at 4 o'clock in the morning, whistling and cheerfully lashing his horse. End quote. I want to end with just one final quote from the book, and this is a quote from Book 4 in a long section where Hugo is talking about slang, and he's talking about the slang of the prisons, the slang of the criminal class. And so, of course, he might as well be talking about today the class of criminals of America, the underside, the vulnerable, homeless, drug-addicted population that exists in the modern world today. And in this section, Hugo says what I think is crucial to getting the translation of the title right. He says, everyone suffers. The rich suffer as well. This is not a book about suffering, Hugo says. This is why the book can't be translated as The Miserables. It's not about misery. It's about something else. Quote, let us have compassion on the chastised. Alas, who are we ourselves? Who am I who now addresses you? Who are you who are listening to me? And are you very sure that we have done nothing before we were born? The earth is not devoid of resemblance to a jail. Who knows whether man is not a recaptured offender against divine justice? Look closely at life. It is so made that everywhere we feel the sense of punishment. Skipping a bit. Thoughtful minds make but little use of the phrase the fortunate and the unfortunate. In this world, evidently the vestibule of another, there are no fortunate. The real human division is this: the luminous and the shady. To diminish the number of the shady, to augment the number of the luminous, that is the object. That is why we cry, education, science. To teach reading means to light the fire. Every syllable spelled out sparkles. End quote. Thank you for watching.